Let me start with something simple. You're moving through your day. A situation comes up, maybe a customer, maybe something internal. You handle it. You move things forward. Nothing feels off. It actually feels reasonable. And then later, something comes back and you think, I should have caught that earlier. Most founders and small business owners I talk to have had that moment, not because they're careless, not because they're inexperienced, but because something was influencing the way they were operating and it wasn't obvious at the time. And when founders describe those moments, they don't usually say, I made a bad decision. They say things like, I didn't see it. I didn't think of that. I didn't realize. That's not just a mistake. That's something that was missed. This session is about that moment and what was actually happening while it still felt reasonable. Not strategy, not working harder, but the conditions you were operating under while you were acting or deciding. So here's what I want to do with this. By the end of this session, you'll have a way to catch a moment like that earlier while it still feels manageable, before it turns into something you look back on and think, I should have caught that earlier. And the key is you won't need more data. You won't need a new system. You'll be able to see it while it's happening because you'll know what to look for. By the way, my name is William Holsten. Over the past year, I've been studying these moments across founders and small business owners, trying to understand what actually increases the likelihood of those moments. And what I want to do next is show you what that looks like. Let's make this real right away. Think of something in the last few weeks where later you actually thought, I should have caught that earlier. Don't type yet. What was happening at the time? Rushed? Tired? Too many things? Too many assumptions? Now go ahead, type a word or two in the chat about what was happening at the time. When I've asked this in live sessions, these are the kinds of responses that came back. You might recognize yourself in one of these. Rushed. Too many things at once. Unexpected issues popping up. Trying to juggle everything. Assuming things were fine. Moving fast because I had to. Lots of unexpected things thrown at me. For some of you, something came to mind right away. For others, this may connect as we go. But notice what's not in that list. Nobody said bad decision. They all describe the conditions. Here's one of my own like that. It was my invention, Pitch Burst, a unique dunk tank-like game for party rental companies. The concept worked, the design worked, but the materials weren't ready yet. We chose to scale up using wooden fabrication for that market. And when paying customers started using it, things broke. We had returns, refunds, rework, and that got very expensive. Looking back, it feels obvious. But at the time, we were doing what made sense based on what we were seeing. The problem is we weren't seeing everything. It did feel obvious. We should have seen that coming. But in the moment, it didn't feel like a mistake. And that's the part that matters. By the way, we later switched to steel fabrication and it succeeded. The mistake isn't the interesting part. What was happening around you at the time is, because that's what determines what you notice and what you don't, because that's what actually you have access to while you're in it at the time. That's the pattern. To explore that, we looked at over 300 founders and small business owners, and we focused on real situations, things that actually happened, and the things they were worried about that might happen next. And we looked closely at how those situations were described. Separately, we used a short 12-question assessment to understand how founders tend to operate under pressure, not what decisions they made, but how they were operating when they made them. So when we looked across all those situations, almost every founder, 89%, had experienced at least one meaningful mistake in the last year, and many had experienced several. But what mattered wasn't the number. It was what kept showing up inside those situations, not the decisions and actions themselves, but the conditions shaping them. Stress, fatigue, distractions, faulty assumptions, often all of these in combination. And when those conditions stack up, something else changes. That's what you notice. When we asked founders what they fear most, they listed things like customer harm, financial mistakes, hiring decisions, all the things you'd expect. What was more interesting, it wasn't just the mistakes, it's what was happening at the time. Most of those situations looked obvious after the fact, but in the moment, they didn't feel risky. They felt like things were working. And that led many to underestimate their own mistake risk, because what's changing is the conditions around you and how they're shaping what you see. And that's the gap between what you notice and what slips by unnoticed until it matters. That's exactly what you saw in the examples in the chat earlier. Here's what started to become clear. On the surface, we see outcomes, missed signals, wrong hires, preventable losses, and we explain those as decision mistakes. But when you step back, something is shaping those decisions. That's performance. What you notice, what you miss, how certain you feel, and what you don't even think to question. That's where a lot of risk hides. And when this happens, your judgment isn't as reliable as it feels in the moment. And underneath that are the conditions: stress, fatigue, distraction, faulty assumptions, and more. When those conditions change, your performance changes. And that's what drives the outcome. These aren't personality flaws. These are operating conditions around you. So what looks like a decision problem actually started earlier. Across all those should have caught it sooner situations, the same conditions keep showing up. Stress, fatigue, distraction, each one of these does something very specific. Stress narrows your thinking. Fatigue reduces your ability to question. Distraction breaks your attention. And then questionable or faulty assumptions start creeping in. Signals get missed. Gaps show up. Assumptions fill gaps. These aren't unusual. They're part of running a business, and they're happening whether you notice them or not. So where does this actually show up? Typically not in dramatic failure moments, but in normal business weeks. A product launch week, hiring decisions, customer issues, travel, multiple projects. You could make up your own list of weekly things. Look at what's happening inside these moments. Deadlines, pressures, late nights caused by fatigue and stress. Quick interviews, assumptions are increasing. Urgent responses to customer complaints. Your attention is narrowed. At travels and conference, you're distracted. You're context switching all day. For multiple projects, you're constantly switching your tasks and you could miss a signal. Nothing feels reckless in the moment, which is exactly why it's so hard to see. It feels like you're moving quickly, doing your job. One of the most important patterns: most costly mistakes don't start costly. They start small, a missed detail, a rushed response, a skipped step. And at that point, everything still feels manageable, but then they build. And often the early signal was there. It just didn't stand out at the time. These are the kind of things founders described. Nothing here on this $50 mistake list looks dramatic on its own. Missed a minor detail, misread an email, forgot to follow up. But these small innocuous things kind of build when they build on top of one another. The one could lead to missing a deadline, a wrong file version, or overlooking a step, which can lead to scope creep, misalignment with your clients, mismanaging a budget, and so on, which can lead to much bigger, more costly things like you failed to deliver. You had a major misunderstanding with a client. Your contract gets complicated, and you can lose clients. That is how these things build. To illustrate what's happening and the change in approach that helps avoid this expensive compounding, let's look at the short video. It begins while driving on a very normal, clear weather day. And then something changes. Same road, same car and driver, very different conditions. During the day, clear visibility, dry road, low stress. At night, in a storm, limited visibility, wet roads, higher uncertainty. Nothing about the road changed, but the conditions did. Now, how would you drive differently when the conditions change like this? Drop a few words in the chat. When conditions change, people don't keep operating the same way. Here's how they naturally adjust. Slow down, pay more attention, be more cautious, focus more, watch out for others, grip the wheel tighter, be more intentional, more system two attention. It reminds myself of driver's ed. You don't change the road, you change how you operate. Operating conditions change in business too, just like on the road. But in business, it doesn't necessarily look like that. It's not one moment where everything suddenly gets worse. Often it's gradual. Even on a longer drive, you start in clear conditions, and before you realize it, you're in nighttime heavy rain or snow. At work, it's a little more fatigue, a little more stress, a little more distraction. And it's easy to keep operating in the same way because nothing feels obviously wrong. But then you're in the danger zone. Fatigue, more stress, more distractions, mistakes become more likely. Or distraction, missed signals, and what else? What would you put in there? Most of you know the answer already because you've already seen it. Mistakes, when these things are stacking, become much more likely. And that's what makes this dangerous. It's not just what you're doing, but the early signals you would normally catch. In our study, we found some founders are pretty steady. Others, a small portion, typically always operate on the edge. But most of us, we move. We move depending on the conditions we're in. And that's an important part. This isn't personality. It isn't character. It isn't whether you're a good founder or a bad one. It's what happens when conditions around you start to stack. And when they do, your thinking shifts, even if you don't notice it. And here's what stood out in the study. A lot of founders would probably place themselves on the steady side. But when we looked at their responses, many were operating at much higher risk levels than they believed. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because these conditions are easy to underestimate when you're in them. Now, please put a post in a chat, a word or two about this question. How do you recognize when conditions start to stack or when you start to slip? And if you pay attention, there are early signs. You probably felt some version of this. I feel scattered. I'm jumping between too many things. I stop thinking things through. I'm reacting instead of planning. I'm more rushed than usual. Things start slipping through the cracks. Too much going on, attention deficit trait. I need 10 extra minutes to lay out my day, or just being too busy. These aren't mistakes, they're signals. So the question becomes, how do you find these signals before mistakes happen? That's what this helps you to do. I have an acronym to help you remember. It's STORM. Here's what to look for when things start happening. You're stressed, the pressure's rising. You're tired, you don't have energy, and you're thinking more slowly. You're overloaded doing too many things at once. You're rushed. Between things, you're moving faster than you should or are comfortable. And you miss signals. Things that you should notice just get by you. Also, sometimes in a new situation, it's a lack of experience or clarity because you haven't done it before. These are not outcomes. They are signals that your thinking is changing. They're early warnings. They show up before mistakes do. And importantly, They rarely show up alone. They stack. You can have STORM all at the same time. Individually, they're manageable. Stacked, they reduce your capacity and your range. You've already seen these, you just didn't label them this way. So if storm helps you recognize it, safer is how you respond. When we looked at the founders who handled these situations very well, these storm conditions, they weren't doing something complicated. They were making small adjustments at the right moments. Sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes five, just enough time to think a little more clearly. And these adjustments followed a pattern that I call safer. This isn't something new to learn. It's something you already do when you're at your best. Slow down when you need to think more clearly. Assumptions check to ensure you're acting on solid facts. Focus during high-risk work. Remove distractions that sidetrack you. Put up energy guardrails to manage your own energy, like scheduling critical work for the time of day when you know you're at your best. And raise small issues early. The study showed us, especially under high stress, founders and owners tend to delay handling small issues. The first two of these are about awareness and remembering to pause. The next two are about how you execute work. And the last is a communication habit. These are not general habits. They're adjustments you make in the moment. Nothing about the situation changes, only how you respond to it. In a single image, this is the connection. Storm helps you recognize what's happening while you're in it, and safer is how you respond in that same moment. When conditions shift, your response should shift also. Notice, then adjust before your thinking locks in. That's the whole idea. Here's what that looks like in a normal founder week. Imagine it's a product launch week or some other important event in your business. Deadlines tighten. Customer emails are increasing. You're there much later at night for several days in a row. Now you've got stress, fatigue, and distraction, not because anything unusual happened, because this is what a lot of founder weeks actually look like. And then what can happen? A customer concern gets overlooked. A critical assumption goes untested. A decision gets made too quickly, and we go right away with the most obvious explanation, not the best one. But what if it's something else? That's where mistakes compound. This is the stormy pattern. Nothing here feels reckless in the moment. It feels like moving fast through a normal week. Now let's look at the same exact situation. Same week, same deadlines, emails and late nights, same conditions. But this time, there's a small shift in how you respond. You pause before responding. That's the S, slow down. You ask, what might I be missing? That's the A, assumptions check. You give this your full attention. That's the F, the focus during high risk work. And because of that, the signal gets caught early and a better decision gets made. Nothing about the situation changed, only the response. And that changes what happens next. Let's pull this together. Conditions in your business are not static. They move. Sometimes they're normal and you operate normally. Then conditions start building. You need to be a little more intentional. And sometimes conditions stack. Stress on top of fatigue, on top of distraction. This is where it matters most. This is where you need to operate differently. And then things ease. You return gradually, and eventually you're back to normal. The mistake most founders make is operating the same way across all of these. Same business, different conditions, different response required. If this sounds familiar, there's one question that matters most in these moments. Has the situation changed? And am I still operating like it hasn't? This is the question to ask yourself as soon as you start to feel that shift. And if the answer is yes, slow down and adjust. The key takeaway is if you're a founder or a small business owner, you're likely one of us who move when operating conditions change. Think about it. Where are you now on this spectrum? If you're curious and aren't sure where you fall on the spectrum, There's a short, free online assessment I put together based on the study we've been talking about. It takes about 3 minutes, and it gives you a quick personal snapshot of how you tend to operate under pressure. And it also gives a few simple ideas on how to lower your risk in situations like this and to see patterns earlier. A reminder of what we covered today. It's just a way to make it more visible. It's available right now for free. Try it. And for some of you, as you were thinking about the situations earlier, you might be thinking, I'd want help working through something like that. That's what led me to start developing something I call the Founder Risk Lab. It's a small working session where we take real situations from your business and apply this storm safer lens in the moment. Not more theory, but working through actual decisions while you're in them. I'm starting to shape this with a small number of founders now and continuing to refine when we learn what's most useful. If you're curious about that, feel free to reach out. Let me leave you with one thought. Most mistakes don't come from lack of effort or lack of care. They come from operating with a slightly incomplete view of what's happening. Speed is part of it, but that's not the whole story. The goal isn't perfection. It's seeing just a little more clearly, a little earlier. If you think back to the situation you had earlier in the first chat, it probably didn't feel like a mistake at the time. It felt reasonable. It felt necessary. It felt right. The goal isn't to eliminate those moments. It's to notice them earlier and adjust.